Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take complex topics, dig into the best sources we can find, and boil it all down to the essentials, just for you.
And today, we're tackling a conflict that really cast a long shadow over the 20th century.
That's right. And even what we call it tells a story. In the West, mostly the Vietnam War.
But if you're in Vietnam, it's often the American War. That difference alone, it signals the multiple perspectives we need to explore here.
Absolutely. We're talking about a conflict that stretched really from 1954 all the way to 1975. Decades.
And it wasn't just one thing, was it? It was tangled up with the earlier Indochina Wars, French colonialism, and of course the huge Cold War standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Exactly. So our mission today is to navigate all that complexity. We've gathered the sources, and we want to give you that shortcut to really understanding it. The key drivers, the players, the big moments, the human cost, without getting totally lost in the details.
Think of it as getting you truly well-informed, fast. So let's set the scene. At its heart, you had North Vietnam pushing hard for unification under communism, backed by the Soviets and China.
And opposing them was South Vietnam, trying to stay independent, more Western aligned, with the United States as its main backer.
Right. And facing them both were the Viet Cong communist allies operating within the South.
And the scale of U.S. involvement became, well, immense. Over 500,000 American troops there by 1969.
While at the same time, the Soviets and Chinese were pouring billions in aid and weapons into North Vietnam. It was this global struggle played out locally, but its roots go way back.
Let's dig into those roots then. The genesis of conflict, from French colonialism to a divided nation.
Yeah, it's crucial to get this. The Vietnam War didn't just spring up in the 50s. It grew directly out of those earlier Indochina Wars in the 1940s and 50s.
It's against the French, primarily. Vietnam had been a French colony for ages, right?
Yeah.
So there was already this long history of fighting for independence.
Exactly. Nationalist groups like Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh were already active. They were inspired by Chinese and Soviet communism, sure, but the core drive was nationalism, independence.
They fought the Japanese during World War II, and then boom, right after, they turned their attention back to the French.
And that French Indochina War lasted 8 long years, from 46 to 54. And here's a key point. From the sources, the U.S. was already involved then.
Not with troops, though.
No, not combat troops, but providing huge amounts of money and supplies to help France fight that war. So American entanglement started much earlier than most people think. It wasn't sudden.
Okay, so it was a gradual deepening. And that war reached its climax where?
At Dien Bien Phu, May 1954. The Viet Minh delivered this absolutely shattering defeat to the French forces.
A real turning point. Signaled the end of French colonial power there.
Completely. And it forced the issue at the Geneva Conference that summer. The result was the Geneva Accords in July 54.
Which were supposed to be the solution, right?
Yeah.
The path forward.
That was the idea. They temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Just a military demarcation line, supposedly.
Okay, so North Vietnam, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, capital in Hanoi.
And South Vietnam, the state of Vietnam, capital in Saigon, nominally under Emperor Bao Dai, though the French were handing over power.
And the Accords laid out practical steps. A DMZ, troops withdraw.
Yeah, a demilitarized zone, mutual withdrawal, and critically, a 300-day period for civilians to move north or south if they wanted.
But the really crucial part, the part that sets up the tragedy, was the plan for elections, wasn't it?
Exactly. Nationwide elections were scheduled for 1956. The idea was to reunify the country under whichever government won.
A plan that famously never happened.
Never happened. And that failure, you could argue, is where the path to the next war, the American War, really began. To America's initial gambit, preventing the domino fall.
So Vietnam's divided. What's the immediate U.S. reaction? Eisenhower's in charge.
Eisenhower sees this division, maybe not ideal, but his main goal is stopping communism in Asia. The domino theory is really taking hold.
Right. The idea that if one country falls, the neighbors will follow.
Precisely. So he launches what the sources call a crash program of assistance to South Vietnam, proactive containment.
And it's not just money.
Oh no, it's strategic. June 54, they set up the Saigon military mission, covert stuff, led by Air Force Colonel Edward Lansdale.
What were they doing?
Psychological warfare, paramilitary activities, trying to build up the South, undermine the North quietly.
Meanwhile, the Vietnamese aren't just packing up and leaving the South entirely.
No, strategically, they knew the South would be unstable. So even as their main forces went north, they left behind political operatives, propagandists, expecting chaos they could exploit later.
Clever, really.
Into this mess steps Ngo Dinh Diem, He becomes premier of South Vietnam.
And he's facing enemies everywhere. The North, obviously. Those Viet Minh agents left behind. Powerful armed religious groups in the South.
Even factions in his own army. Sounds impossible. It was incredibly precarious. And Diem himself wasn't exactly a unifying figure, but he had one massive advantage.
U.S. backing.
Full-throated U.S. backing. Military advisors training his army, American style. CIA operatives helping him sideline opponents, sometimes through bribery, sometimes other means.
And economic aid.
Huge amounts. Propping up the economy and crucially helping resettle about 900,000 refugees, mostly Catholics who fled the North. That built a loyal base for Diem, but also deepened divisions.
So initially, it looks like it's working. Diem seems to get a grip.
Yeah. By late 1955, he'd managed to defeat those armed sects, arrested a lot of communists who maybe came out too early expecting those elections.
Ah, the elections. He wasn't going to let those happen, was he?
Not a chance. He publicly denounced the nationwide election plan from Geneva. Instead, he holds his own referendum, just in the South.
And declares himself president of the Republic of Vietnam in October '55.
Exactly. And the North. They weren't ready for another war yet. Their allies, China and the Soviets, weren't pushing for intervention at that point, so Diem gets away with it.
But by refusing those elections, he basically tears up the Geneva Accords and cements the division.
He does, and that act fundamentally shapes everything that comes next. 3. The seeds of internal decay and the birth of the Viet Cong.
So Washington's feeling pretty good about Diem initially, surprised and delighted, as the sources say.
Yeah, but that success was really just on the surface. Underneath, there were these massive, fatal problems brewing within Diem's own regime.
The rot from within, as you said, what were the core issues?
Well, Diem himself, apparently a poor administrator, he wouldn't delegate, trusted almost no one outside his family, highly suspicious.
That sounds like a recipe for dysfunction.
It was! And then there was his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu.
Ah, Nuhu. He becomes infamous, doesn't he?
Deeply. He ran this vast network of corruption, extortion, payoffs, influence peddling through a secret organization called the Ken Lao.
Secret police, basically.
More than that, it infiltrated everything. Government, military, schools, businesses. Imagine living under that kind of pervasive control and corruption. It bred incredible resentment.
And out in the countryside, things weren't getting better for ordinary people.
No. Promised reforms were neglected. Local officials were often corrupt. And many officials, including Diem and Nhu, were Northerners and Catholic in a largely Southern Buddhist country.
So a massive disconnect with the population. Alienation.
Complete alienation. And that created the perfect breeding ground for the communists to make a comeback.
So Diem's crackdown in '55 hadn't finished them off.
It definitely hurt them, disorganized them. Thousands were arrested. But by 1957, the communists, now increasingly called the Viet Cong, or VC, they shifted tactics.
How so?
They began a campaign of terrorism and assassination, targeting government officials, village chiefs, anyone linked to the regime. It was brutal.
And this is a critical point from the sources. The VC ranks weren't just communists, right?
Absolutely not. They were filled with many ordinary, non-communist Vietnamese who were just fed up with the corruption, the intimidation from Diem's local officials. Diem's regime was effectively driving people into the arms of the insurgency.
Wow. So by '59, things are escalating. Armed clashes.
Yeah. Small bands of VC started engaging ARVN units, the South Vietnamese Army. Then Hanoi's Communist Party officially sanctioned using armed force to overthrow Diem. They started sending trained insurgents, cadres, down from the north.
This is the start of the new war.
That's what the sources call it, the real beginning.
And the ARVN, the South Vietnamese Army, how are they equipped to handle this, even with U.S. training?
Poorly. The sources say they were ill-adapted. High-ranking officers often got positions because of family ties or politics, not skill. So you had apathy, incompetence, corruption at the top.
And infiltration.
Riddled with it. Viet Cong agents were everywhere, from drivers right up to senior officers. A massive security nightmare.
Plus, the U.S. gear wasn't ideal.
Right. Heavy tanks, big trucks. It made them a road-bound force. They couldn't chase the VC effectively into the swamps and jungles.
And American advisors.
Often hampered. Short tours, usually under a year. Many didn't speak Vietnamese. Hard to build trust and deep understanding like that.
So the VC had a structure advantage, too. The NLF and PLAF.
Definitely. The National Liberation Front, NLF, was the political umbrella, trying to look like a broad movement. The People's Liberation Armed Forces, PLAF, was the military wing.
And they had different levels.
Yeah, 3 main tiers. Village guerrillas, part-timers, doing intimidation, recruiting, basic stuff. Then local regional forces, full-time soldiers operating within a province, better equipped.
And the main force.
Those were the full-time hardcore units operating nationally from remote bases, ready for bigger fights. A very adaptable structure.
And here's that crazy detail. Where did many of their guns come from?
Ironically, from the United States. Either captured from the ARVN in battle or just straight up bought from corrupt South Vietnamese officials.
Unbelievable. The system was literally arming its own enemies.
It shows just how deep the rot went in Diem's South Vietnam, for Kennedy's dilemma and the deepening U.S. commitment.
Okay, so fast forward to mid-1960. The situation sounds dire for the South.
It absolutely was. Viet Cong attacks were happening constantly, over 100 a month. Thousands of officials assassinated in 1960 alone. The ARVN just couldn't keep up.
Did Washington and Saigon realize how bad it was?
It took a while for the penny to drop. Apparently, a VC attack that overran an ARVN headquarters in January 60 was a real wake-up call for the Americans in Vietnam. That's when they started seriously thinking about more aid and trying to get Diem to reform.
Then Kennedy comes into office in 61.
Mm.
How does his administration see Vietnam?
As both a major challenge and maybe an opportunity. They saw the Viet Cong insurgency as a classic example of this new Soviet-Chinese strategy of wars of national liberation.
So Vietnam becomes a test case.
Exactly, a test of America's ability to fight counterinsurgency. Can the U.S. beat this new kind of communist threat?
And Kennedy bought into the domino theory, too.
Oh, yeah. The sources say he accepted it without serious question. Vietnam was the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia. Losing it would be a massive blow to U.S. credibility globally.
But he had other huge crises on his plate early on, right? Berlin, Cuba.
Absolutely. The Berlin Wall, the Bay of Pigs disaster in Cuba, ongoing trouble in Laos. These were arguably more pressing.
So did Vietnam get pushed to the back burner?
Not entirely. Paradoxically, for some of his advisors, those other crises actually made success in Vietnam seem more important. Like, they needed a win somewhere to prove American resolve.
Okay, but on the ground in Vietnam, things were still getting worse.
Relentlessly. NLF membership was growing, ARVN kept losing battles, and infiltration from the north ramped up significantly.
How many people are we talking about coming down?
U.S. intelligence estimated maybe 4,000 cadres infiltrated in 1960. By 1962, almost 13,000. Many were experienced Southern communists returning to lead the fight.
And they weren't just sending people, right? Weapons, too.
Yeah, the supply lines were getting serious, steel-hulled junk sneaking down the coast, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos.
That infamous trail.
It was becoming a real network, no longer just footpaths, but roads capable of handling trucks. A huge logistical upgrade for the North.
Despite all this, the U.S. kept backing Diem, even with his problems.
Largely, yes. Stability, even flawed stability, seemed preferable. Vice President Johnson visited Saigon in May 61. Mostly a symbolic visit to boost aid and show commitment.
Kennedy must have wanted a clearer picture.
He did. He sent Walt Rostow, an economist, and General Maxwell Taylor, former Army Chief of Staff, to Vietnam in late 61.
And their report, what did it say?
It was pretty blunt. They concluded South Vietnam was losing the war and didn't have the will or ability to fix it alone, a direct contradiction to the optimistic reports often coming out of Saigon.
So what did Rostow and Taylor recommend?
A big step up in military aid helicopters, armored personnel carriers, that kind of thing, and significantly putting U.S. advisors and technical experts at all levels of the Vietnamese government and military.
Wow, embedding them deeply. What about combat troops?
They recommended a limited number, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were pushing for that too. The idea of American boots on the ground was officially on the table.
That must have put Kennedy in a tough spot.
A very tough spot. He knew the political danger of losing Vietnam to communism, but he was also really hesitant about getting into another land war in Asia, especially after Korea.
So what was the compromise?
They decided not to send combat units, for now, but they did go all in on the expanded aid and advisory program from the Rostow-Taylor report.
Meaning more American personnel.
A lot more. They created the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam USMACV, a 4-star command in Saigon, and the number of U.S. military personnel just exploded. From under 800 in the late 50s to around 9,000 by mid-1962.
9,000, that's a serious escalation, even without direct combat rules yet.
It was a fundamental deepening of the U.S. commitment, setting the stage for everything that followed. V, the unintended consequences, strategic hamlets, Buddhist crisis, and regime change.
Okay, so the U.S. fled South Vietnam with new weapons, more advisors. Does this turn the tide initially?
Well, the ARVN did go on the offensive for a bit, and the Diem government launched this big program called the Strategic Hamlet Program.
Right, I remember reading about this. The idea was to gather villagers into fortified hamlets for protection.
Exactly. Protect them, but also isolate them from the Viet Cong. It was based on a program the British used in Malaya, which seemed successful there.
But Vietnam wasn't Malaya. Did it work?
Not really. The sources say the fatal flaw was it was virtually impossible to tell which Vietnamese were to be protected and which excluded. Plus, people resented the forced labor being moved from ancestral lands.
So it backfired.
Massively.
Hmm.
Many hamlets ended up having as many VC recruits inside the walls as outside. It actually helped the VC.
Meanwhile, the Viet Congs are adapting to the new U.S. tech, helicopters, APCs.
Yeah, they learned fast. Helicopters were vulnerable to ground fire. Armored personnel carriers could be stopped by targeting the exposed crew.
Yeah.
And the ARVN leadership, still plagued by incompetence and infighting.
Is there a specific battle that highlighted these problems?
At Bangak, January 1963, a VC battalion, even though outnumbered and surrounded, managed to break out, shooting down 5 helicopters, killing scores of ARVN soldiers and 3 American advisors.
A real wake-up call. Or should have been.
Should have been.
Huh.
Some American journalists started reporting on these failures, and lower-level U.S. advisors often agreed.
But the official line from Saigon was still positive.
Largely, yes. The sources mention this large and powerful bureaucracy. People like General Paul Harkins, the USMACV commander, and Ambassador Frederick Nolting kept assuring Washington everything was fine. A dangerous disconnect.
And then things really started to unravel for Diem personally, didn't they? Summer of '63.
Yeah, doubts about his government were growing, fueled by the increasingly bizarre behavior of his family.
New again.
No, yes. U.S. intelligence even suspected he was secretly talking to the North, and his wife, Madame New,
She was very outspoken, wasn't she?
extremely, very influential, pushing Catholic causes and openly mocking the country's Buddhist majority, just pouring fuel on the fire.
And that fire ignited.
May 1963. Buddhist protests in Saigon and Hue were met with violence, arrests. Then, in June, that horrifying image.
The monk setting himself on fire. Pitch Quang Duke.
Yes, those photos went global. Front pages everywhere.
Yeah.
It massively raised awareness about the repression under Diem.
Did things escalate further?
Oh, yes. In August, government forces launched brutal raids on Buddhist pagodas. That seemed to be the last straw for some ARVN generals.
They decided to move against Diem.
They secretly reached out to the U.S. Embassy, basically asking, if we stage a coup, what will you do?
And the U.S. response.
According to the sources, far from discouraging. Officially neutral, but the embassy stayed in touch with the plotters and made no effort to help Diem or New. Effectively, a green light.
So the coup happens.
November 1st, 1963. ARVN units take Saigon, seize the palace. Diem and New are captured trying to flee, and then murdered by the army.
A violent end. And just weeks later,
Kennedy himself is assassinated, less than 3 weeks after Diem.
leaving this whole mess to Lyndon B. Johnson.
Exactly. Johnson inherits this legacy of indecision, half measures, and gradually increasing involvement. He was focused on domestic issues, his Great Society programs.
So they couldn't ignore Vietnam.
No. Like Kennedy, he felt the immense political pressure not to lose Vietnam. He shared the view of his advisors, many inherited from Kennedy, that U.S. credibility was on the line.
So no major change in policy.
If anything, a deepening commitment. He replaced Harkins with General William Westmoreland, and the number of U.S. personnel climbed again from 16,000 when Diem died to 23,000 by the end of 1964. The path was set for further escalation. 6. The Gulf of Tonkin and the leap to full-scale war.
So Johnson takes over, Diem is gone, but things in Saigon don't exactly stabilize, do they?
Not at all. The hope that removing Diem would lead to a stronger government quickly dashed. There was a short-lived military junta, then another coup in January '64, bringing General Nguyen Khan to power. Just constant instability.
And Hanoi sees this weakness.
They absolutely do. They sense victory might be close, so they make a huge decision. He commit their own regular army units, the NVA, to the fight in the south.
Sending them down the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Yes, and that trail is now becoming seriously upgraded. Truck capable. This is a major escalation from the north.
And they're getting outside help.
Massive help. Mao in China is strongly backing them weapons, logistical troops, and the Soviets, even though they weren't friendly with China, also start pouring in aid. It becomes a bit of a competition to support Hanoi.
With Saigon in chaos and the North committing regular troops, what's the thinking in Washington?
Striking North Vietnam directly starts to look like the only option to shore up the South.
Weren't there already some low-level operations against the North?
Yeah, small-scale stuff, clandestine raids by South Vietnamese forces, supported by U.S. advisors, agent drops, but nothing strategically significant. By summer '64, the Pentagon has actual plans drawn up for airstrikes against the North.
Aiming to hurt them, maybe slow down support for the VC.
That was the idea. Some of Johnson's advisors wanted him to get Congress on board first, get a resolution giving him authority to act.
But Johnson hesitated. Election year.
Exactly. He preferred to wait until after the November election, didn't want it becoming a campaign issue.
But then something happened in August '64 that changed everything. The Gulf of Tonkin.
That's right, August 2nd. The USS Maddox, a destroyer doing electronic surveillance, gets attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats.
Was it completely unprovoked?
Well, context is key. The day before, South Vietnamese boats had conducted raids nearby. The North might have thought the Maddox was part of that. Anyway, the Maddox wasn't damaged, drove off the attackers.
Johnson's reaction.
Keep patrolling! Sends another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, to join the Maddox. Then, the night of August 4th, the two ships report another attack.
A second attack. Was it confirmed?
This is where it gets murky. The Maddox's captain himself quickly radioed back, cautioning that the evidence for the second attack was inconclusive. Bad weather, jumpy sonar operators.
But Johnson and his team decided to act as if it had happened.
They did. Under pressure, wanting to look strong, they chose to believe the second attack was real.
And launched retaliatory strikes.
Immediately. Airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval bases, and then Johnson went to Congress.
Asking for that resolution his advisors had mentioned earlier.
Yes. Asking for broad authority to take action in Southeast Asia. It sailed through both houses overwhelmingly by August 7th, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution.
But Congress didn't have the full picture.
Not even close. Few knew about the doubts surrounding the second attack. Fewer still knew about the connection to the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese raids, or that the Maddox was on an intelligence mission.
These emissions were huge.
They would come back to haunt the administration later, but in the short term, it worked politically. Vietnam was off the table as an election issue. Johnson won re-election in a landslide.
And he now had a blank check from Congress to escalate the war.
Essentially, yes. The path from advisory role to full-blown combat was now wide open.
Okay.
7th, the full plunge, escalation, and the limits of attrition.
Okay, so Johnson wins the election. He has the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. But the situation in Vietnam itself is still deteriorating between August and November '64.
Absolutely. Saigon's government is a revolving door. Some regimes barely lasted a month. And out in the countryside, the Viet Cong are getting stronger, bolder.
Bolder how?
They start deliberately targeting Americans. A big mortar attack on the U.S. airbase at Bien Hoa near Saigon in November. That really got Washington's attention.
So the pressure builds to retaliate against the North.
Yes. Most of Johnson's advisors are pushing for it. The arguments are, it'll boost South Vietnamese morale, show U.S. resolve, make Hanoi pay a price, maybe even reduce their ability to supply the South.
Was there universal agreement on how to bomb the North?
No, there was debate. The military generally favored a quick, intense campaign, short and sharp. But civilian advisors like George Bundy and John McNaughton argued for graduated air attacks, start smaller, slowly increase the pressure.
Anyone arguing against bombing altogether?
Yes. Undersecretary of State George Ball was a notable voice of caution. Vice President Humphrey also warned it would likely just lead to deeper U.S. commitment and political trouble at home.
But Johnson sided with the majority.
He felt he had to act to stop Saigon from collapsing. So, mid-February 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder begins. Sustained bombing of North Vietnam. Quietly at first, no big public announcement.
And it followed that graduated approach.
Yes. Targets expanded, frequency increased, but it was tightly controlled from the White House. They were careful not to hit Soviet ships in port or targets too close to China, trying to avoid widening the war.
Did the bombing actually work? Did it impact the war in the South?
The consensus from the sources is little direct impact. Despite the bombing, the communists seemed to be gaining ground in the South. Air power alone wasn't stopping them.
Which leads to the next logical, or perhaps illogical step.
Ground troops. By mid-March '65, General Westmoreland and the Joint Chiefs are telling the White House, we need U.S. combat troops on the ground, or South Vietnam will fall.
That must have been a monumental decision for Johnson, given the memory of Korea.
Huge. He was very reluctant. But the choice seemed stark. Commit troops or face defeat. By June, Westmoreland is predicting imminent collapse without U.S. intervention.
So Johnson makes the call.
Yes. After a final assessment by Defense Secretary McNamara in July, Johnson authorizes sending 100,000 troops immediately, with another 100,000 planned for 1966.
How did he announce this? Did he declare war?
No, and this is crucial. He announced it at a news conference. No declaration of war, no address to Congress asking for one, no move to put the U.S. economy on a war footing, and importantly, no calling up the National Guard or reserves.
So a massive commitment, but presented almost incrementally, trying not to fully alarm the public.
That seems to have been the approach, but the U.S. was now fully committed to a major land war.
Okay, the troops start arriving. But was there a clear plan for what they would do?
Surprisingly little thought seems to have gone into that, compared to the debate over sending them. Westmoreland was largely given free rein to run the ground war.
Did he unify command with the South Vietnamese?
No, he was reluctant to push for that despite doubts about ARVN leadership. They relied on coordination and the existing advisory setup, a potential weakness from the start.
And the U.S. built up a massive infrastructure to support these troops.
Enormous. New air bases, deep water ports, hospitals, warehouses, a huge logistical footprint.
And the fighting started quickly. Fall of '65.
Yes. Bloody battles like Aya draining in the Central Highlands. U.S. forces used overwhelming firepower airstrikes, artillery, B-52s, inflicting huge losses on the NVA and VC.
But did that break the enemy's will?
Apparently not. The communists felt they held their own, and they knew they could just melt away and reoccupy areas after the Americans left.
So what was Westmoreland's core strategy?
Attrition. Use U.S. firepower to find and destroy the enemy's main force units, mostly in remote areas. Create a shield for the ARVN to handle pacification in the populated areas. The goal was to kill enemy soldiers faster than they could be replaced until Hanoi gave up.
The infamous body count strategy.
Exactly. Measure progress by enemy killed.
Did it look like it was working to people back home?
Not really. By 66, 67, casualties were mounting. The war on TV looked confusing, often futile, and the body counts themselves became notorious for being inflated and unreliable.
Was this strategy questioned internally?
Yes. A 1966 Army study called P-ORVN argued against attrition, saying the focus should be on securing the rural population. But it was largely ignored by the commanders at the time.
So the U.S. continued with big search-and-destroy operations.
Yes, operations like Cedar Falls and Junction City. They'd sweep through areas, capture supplies, but the enemy would usually slip away and return later. Indecisive, ultimately.
And then there was Agent Orange.
Used extensively to deny the enemy forest cover. Killed vegetation effectively, yes, but caused massive ecological damage and exposed countless people, Vietnamese and Americans, to toxic chemicals with devastating long-term health consequences.
Along the DMZ, the U.S. set up fortified bases.
Yes, trying to block infiltration. But the NVA skillfully attacked these bases, drawing U.S. forces into costly battles like Quezon Son later on.
But most combat wasn't these big set-piece battles.
No, the sources say most engagements were small, brief ambushes, firefights, often lasting minutes, but still resulting in heavy U.S. casualties over time.
Did the U.S. inflict more casualties on the communists?
Yes, far more. But North Vietnam had a deep well of manpower, and crucially, they could control the tempo of the war by withdrawing to sanctuaries in Laos, Cambodia, or North Vietnam when needed. Hanoi largely dictated the pace.
And the air war, Rolling Thunder, continued against the North.
Yes, getting more intense. More bombs dropped on North Vietnam by the end of '66 than on Japan in WWII or in the entire Korean War.
But still indecisive. Why wasn't it working?
Fundamentally, North Vietnam was agricultural, few major industries to destroy, and most of their vital war supplies came from China and the Soviet Union, arriving by sea or rail, often through routes the U.S. was reluctant to hit hard for fear of escalating the war.
So the supplies kept flowing.
Pretty much. A CIA report after heavy bombing in '66 found no discernible shortages, and the North, with Soviet and Chinese help, built formidable air defenses. The U.S. lost almost 500 aircraft and hundreds of crewmen by the end of '66. Air power wasn't the magic bullet.
The war comes home, and the nation's doubts.
So, by 1967, how is the war playing back in the United States?
Dissatisfaction is really growing. You have strong moral opposition, especially from students, intellectuals, clergy. They're horrified by civilian casualties, by supporting what they see as a corrupt Saigon regime.
And this opposition is becoming visible. Protests.
Very visible. Campus protests, chants like, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? That big march on the Pentagon in October 67, 35,000 people. It was becoming mainstream.
But it wasn't just moral opposition.
No. Many more Americans were just getting weary. Mounting casualties, no clear end in sight. And then you had others who thought Johnson wasn't fighting hard enough, that the military's hands were tied. Public support for Johnson's handling of the war dropped below 50% by summer 67. The consensus was fracturing.
What's the mood in Hanoi around this time?
They're also impatient. They're holding their own, yes, but the U.S. isn't giving up. So summer 67, they decide on something incredibly bold. A massive gamble.
The Tet Offensive.
Exactly. The plan. Simultaneous attacks on cities, towns, bases all across South Vietnam, timed for the Tet Lunar New Year holiday in early 68. They hoped it would trigger popular uprisings and shatter American will.
Did they try to distract the U.S. beforehand?
Yes. Diversionary attacks in late 67. Then in January 68, that big NVA assault on the Marine base at Khe Sanh near the DMZ.
And the U.S. command thought Khe Sanh was the main event.
They did. Johnson, Westmoreland, they became fixated on holding Khe Sanh, drawing comparisons to Dien Bien Phu. They thought communist troop movements near cities were just a feint.
A massive miscalculation.
Huge. January 31st, 1968, while maybe 50,000 U.S. and ARVN troops are tied up around Khe Sanh, the Tet Offensive explodes across the entire country.
The scale must have been shocking.
Unprecedented. Attacks on almost every provincial capital, major cities, dozens of bases. Westmoreland's own headquarters in Saigon attacked. A VC squad even got inside the U.S. Embassy compound for a few hours.
And Hue, that was particularly brutal.
Yes. Communist forces seized large parts of Hue, the old imperial capital, and held on for nearly 3 weeks. Vicious house-to-house fighting.
Militarily, though, how did the offensive turn out for the communists?
It was actually a major military defeat for them. U.S. and ARVN forces, though surprised, reacted quickly. Except for Hue, the VC couldn't hold anywhere for long. Their casualties were enormous.
And the popular uprisings they hoped for?
Never happened. Sources say the ARVN actually fought surprisingly well, defending their homes. And the destructive attacks often alienated the population against the Viet Cong.
So, a tactical failure for Hanoi. But the impact back in the U.S.?
Profoundly different. It sent shockwaves across America. People who believed the official optimism felt betrayed. Doubters felt vindicated.
And television played a huge role.
Massive. Graphic images of fighting in Saigon and Hue. It created this overwhelming sense that things were out of control, that the U.S. was in deep trouble.
Then came that news about Westmoreland asking for more troops.
Right. March 10th. New York Times reports Westmoreland wants 206,000 more troops. The public widely saw this as proof of desperation.
Even though Westmoreland actually saw Tet as an enemy defeat and wanted troops for a knockout blow.
Exactly. But the perception was disaster. Johnson gave the request to his new defense secretary, Clark Clifford.
And Clifford's assessment?
He dug into it and concluded massive reinforcements were a bad idea. He felt the entire war effort needed rethinking.
Did he convince Johnson?
Yes. Clifford, along with other senior advisors, persuaded Johnson that the current troop level, about 550,000, should be the ceiling, and that Johnson needed to make a move towards peace.
Which led to that famous speech.
March 31st, 1968. Johnson goes on TV, announces a partial bombing halt over North Vietnam, says the U.S. is ready for negotiations, and then the bombshell. He would not seek nor accept his party's nomination for another term as president.
Wow, a stunning end to his presidency, forced by the war.
Tet broke the political will to escalate further. It was a turning point, psychologically and politically. TA next. Nixon's honorable exit. Vietnamization and secret diplomacy.
So Johnson steps aside, announces a bombing halt. Does Hanoi respond?
They do pretty quickly. Just 3 days later, they agree to talks. Those talks started in Paris in May 68.
But they didn't lead anywhere fast.
No. Hanoi's condition for serious talks was a complete halt to all U.S. bombing of the North. Meanwhile, the fighting on the ground actually intensified right after Johnson's speech.
More fighting, even with talks starting.
Some of the fiercest of the war, apparently. The communists launched more attacks in May and August. Westmoreland kept up maximum pressure, believing the enemy was weakened after Tet. Casualties on all sides were incredibly high in those months.
So when did the bombing finally stop completely?
October 68. The Soviets secretly passed word that Hanoi would negotiate seriously if all bombing stopped. Johnson, assured it wouldn't hurt the military situation, announced the full halt on Halloween.
Did that break the deadlock in Paris?
Not immediately. It led to weeks of arguments between the U.S. and South Vietnam about how the talks should even proceed. By the time they finally sorted that out, Richard Nixon had won the presidential election.
Nixon takes office in '69. What's his approach, along with Henry Kissinger?
They both believed military victory was impossible. But they were adamant about not just pulling out quickly. They wanted an honorable settlement that gave South Vietnam a reasonable chance of survival. A hasty withdrawal, they felt, would destroy U.S. credibility worldwide.
How did they plan to achieve that?
A two-pronged strategy, really. Put pressure on Hanoi via the Soviets and China, who both wanted better relations with the U.S., and simultaneously threaten North Vietnam with massive force, Nixon's madman theory, making them think he was unpredictable enough to do anything.
Did he act on that threat quickly?
Yes, but secretly. Early '69, responding to new communist attacks, Nixon ordered the bombing of communist bases hidden in Cambodia, near the Vietnamese border. This was based on a suggestion from General Creighton Abrams, Westmoreland's successor.
Bombing Cambodia. Wasn't that neutral?
Officially, yes. But Cambodian leader Prince Sihanouk had apparently confidentially agreed to the bombing, tired of the Vietnamese communists using his country. So Hanoi couldn't publicly protest without admitting they were violating Cambodia's neutrality.
But the bombing didn't stay secret.
No. The story leaked to the New York Times in May '69. Nixon was furious. This paranoia about leaks ultimately led to the illegal surveillance and burglaries that became the Watergate scandal, a direct link.
Alongside the secret bombing, what was the public strategy?
Vietnamization. Basically, speed up the training and equipping of the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, so they could take over the ground war, allowing U.S. troops to withdraw.
Was this driven partly by the ARVN's performance during Tet?
Partly, yes. They had fought better than expected in some places, but mostly it was driven by immense pressure back home to bring U.S. troops home.
So Nixon starts announcing troop withdrawals.
Yes. 25,000 in June '69. More later that year. 150,000 announced over the following year. General Abrams apparently protested it was too fast, that the ARVN wasn't ready, but politically the withdrawals were essential for Nixon.
What effect did these withdrawals have on the U.S. troops still there?
Terrible for morale. A sense of pointlessness, fighting a war America was clearly leaving. Sources point to increased drug use, racial tensions, even fragging, soldiers attacking their own officers. Discipline was eroding.
And then the My Lai massacre story broke.
Late '69, yes. News of U.S. soldiers killing hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians back in March '68. It deeply shocked the American public and further damaged support for the war.
The anti-war movement must have been fueled by all this.
Absolutely. Desertions increased dramatically. Hundreds of thousands evaded the draft. The country was deeply divided over the war and the fairness of the selective service system.
While Vietnamization is happening, the Paris talks are still stalled.
Deadlocked. Kissinger started separate talks with the North Vietnamese, but they were miles apart. U.S. wanted mutual withdrawal. Hanoi wanted unconditional U.S. withdrawal, and Thieu replaced.
Did Nixon consider hitting North Vietnam harder then?
He thought about it, renewed bombing, maybe a blockade. But his advisors warned it might not work and would cause huge political problems, so he held back. For a while.
But he did intervene openly in Cambodia.
Yes, March 1970, after Sihanouk was overthrown by a pro-Western general, Lon Nol, who then tried to kick the communists out, Nixon sent 20,000 U.S. and ARVN troops across the border to destroy communist sanctuaries.
Did it achieve its goals?
They captured a lot of supplies but didn't trap major enemy forces. But the reaction back in the U.S. was explosive.
Kent State.
Kent State University, May 4th, 1970. National Guard troops fire on student protesters, killing 4. Campuses erupted nationwide. Congress repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. A massive backlash.
So after Cambodia, the main strategy really becomes just Vietnamization and withdrawal.
Pretty much. On the surface, Vietnamization seemed to be making some progress against the VC infrastructure, which was weakened after Tet. But its limits were brutally exposed in March '71.
What happened?
Operation Lam Son 719, a major ARVN invasion of Laos to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It ended badly. Heavy casualties, a chaotic retreat, showed the ARVN still wasn't ready to stand alone against the NVA.
Public opinion in the U.S. must have been overwhelmingly negative by now.
Completely. Polls showed over 70% thought sending troops was a mistake. Nearly 60% found the war immoral. Discontent focused heavily on the draft, seen as unfair.
Which led to changes.
College deferments were limited, but draft calls were already decreasing. Nixon ended all draft calls in '72, and in '73 the draft was abolished entirely, moving to an all-volunteer military, a fundamental shift driven by the war's unpopularity.
Okay, so 1972, Hanoi tries another big push.
Yes, the Easter Offensive, March 30th, a full-scale conventional invasion of the South, tanks, artillery. The ARVN initially crumbled.
How did Nixon respond this time?
decisively. Operation Linebacker. Massive U.S. air power unleashed against the invasion force, against North Vietnam itself, mining Haiphong Harbor to block Soviet supplies. It worked. By mid-June, the offensive stalled. Air power could still make a difference.
Did this military failure finally make Hanoi more willing to negotiate seriously?
It seems so. They were finally ready to compromise. The U.S. had already signaled it wouldn't insist on NVA withdrawal from the South. Now Hanoi dropped its demand that few be replaced.
So the key obstacles were removed.
Yes. Based on those concessions, Kissinger and North Vietnam's Le Duc Tho hammered out a peace agreement in secret talks in October '72.
Peace at last.
Not quite. President Thieu in Saigon hit the roof. He hadn't been consulted, refused to accept the terms, demanded dozens of changes.
So Kissinger goes back to Paris.
With Thieu's demands, the North Vietnamese were furious, then proposed their own changes. Talks broke down again.
And Nixon's reaction?
Frustration and force. December '72, he orders the Christmas bombing. Intense B-52 raids on Hanoi and Haiphong, the heaviest bombing of the war, aimed at forcing Hanoi back to the table and maybe persuading Thieu.
Did it work?
After about 8 days, Hanoi agreed to resume talks. The agreement they signed was basically the same one from October. Thieu, under intense U.S. pressure and promises of future aid, reluctantly agreed.
So the Paris Peace Accords are finally signed.
January 27, 1973. Signed by the U.S., North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the South Vietnamese Communists, the PRG.
What were the main points?
Immediate ceasefire. Complete U.S. troop withdrawal and base dismantling within 60 days. Release of all POWs. An international peacekeeping force. South Vietnam's right to self-determination. And crucially, North Vietnamese troops could remain in the South but not be reinforced. The 17th parallel remained a temporary dividing line pending peaceful reunification.
NVA troops staying in the South seems like a huge concession by the U.S. and South Vietnam.
It was, and ultimately it proved fatal for the South.
Yeah.
X, the bitter end, fall of Saigon and lingering legacies.
So the accords are signed. The last U.S. troops leave in March '73. Is the war over?
Not even close. The fighting basically continued, what journalists call the post-war war. Both sides violated the ceasefire constantly.
Did the U.S. keep supporting South Vietnam?
Yes, military aid continued, but Nixon's power was collapsing because of Watergate. He couldn't influence events much anymore.
And Congress stepped in.
They did. Summer '73, they banned all U.S. military operations in Indochina after August 15th. Then, November '73, they passed the War Powers Act over Nixon's veto, limiting the president's power to commit troops abroad without congressional approval, a direct reaction to Vietnam.
So 1974, what's the situation on the ground?
Still fighting, but maybe at a lower intensity. Constant skirmishes along unclear lines of control. Hundreds of Vietnamese still dying every day.
And then Nixon resigns, summer '74.
Yes. And Congress cuts aid to South Vietnam by 30%. Things are looking very bleak for Thieu's government.
How is the South Vietnamese government holding up internally?
Badly. Still corrupt, inefficient, battling massive inflation, unemployment. The army had huge desertion rates. Morale was collapsing.
Did Hanoi sense the end was near?
They tested the waters with an attack on Phuoc Long province in late '74, early '75. The South Vietnamese army collapsed quickly, and crucially, the U.S. did nothing. That gave Hanoi the green light.
For the final offensive.
Early March 1975. They expected to take maybe 2 years.
But it happened much faster.
Incredibly fast. The ARVN just disintegrated. Panic, disorderly retreats from the Central Highlands, then Hue, Da Nang. It was a total collapse in less than 2 months.
Did President Ford try to intervene?
He pleaded with Congress for emergency military aid just to bolster morale, but Congress and the American public, they were done. They wanted to wash their hands of the war.
So Thieu resigns.
April 21st, flees to Taiwan. The end is clearly imminent.
And the fall of Saigon.
April 30th, 1975. The remaining South Vietnamese government surrendered unconditionally. NVA tanks rolled into Saigon without a fight.
Those iconic images of helicopters evacuating people from the U.S. Embassy roof.
Exactly. Frantic air and sea lifts to get out the last Americans and many of their Vietnamese allies and employees. A chaotic, tragic end.
And Vietnam is finally unified.
A military government took control. Then, July 2nd, 1976, it officially became the Socialist Republic of Vietnam with Hanoi as the capital.
No.
Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. The 30-year struggle was over.
The cost. It's just staggering when you look at how much.
Devastating. Vietnam's official estimate is up to 2 million civilians dead, north and south, plus 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. U.S. estimates put ARVN deaths around 200,000, 250,000.
And the U.S. losses?
Over 58,200 names are on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., dedicated in 1982. Service members who died or went missing.
What did post-war Vietnam look like?
Militarily powerful in the region, yes,
Yeah.
but economically shattered. Agriculture, industry disrupted. The countryside scarred by bombs, Agent Orange riddled with unexploded mines, cities damaged.
And many people fled.
A huge exodus in 1975 of those linked to the old regime. Then later, the boat people in '78 fleeing the communist economic policies. Millions became refugees.
And the impact on the United States.
A demoralized military, a deeply divided public, a long, painful process of grappling with defeat in its longest, most controversial war. It challenged America's image of itself, its role in the world.
It took a long time to even reestablish relations.
Until 1995, for formal diplomatic relations to resume. Shows how deep the scars were. Outro. So, wrapping this up, what are the big takeaways from this incredibly complex story?
Well, first, it was never just America's war, was it? It had deep roots in colonialism, Vietnamese nationalism, and Cold War conflicts playing out locally.
Absolutely. And the human cost on all sides was just immense. The impacts on both Vietnam and the U.S. are still felt today. Decades later, it reshaped both nations fundamentally.
And studying it, even though it's tough history, it's so valuable, isn't it, as a case study?
Definitely. For military strategy, political decision-making, the power of public opinion, the long-term consequences of intervention, the lessons are profound and often sobering. It reminds you how interconnected global events are.
Okay, let's leave our listeners with something to think about. A final provocative thought.
How about this? What if those nationwide elections planned for 1956 under the Geneva Accords had actually happened? Given Vietnam's history of division and outside influence, what might have been the result? And how could that different outcome have potentially reshaped Southeast Asia and maybe even the entire Cold War?
That's a huge what if. Definitely something to mull over. Thank you for guiding us through that incredibly dense and difficult history.
My pleasure. It's vital history to understand.
We hope this deep dive has helped you feel more informed, maybe sparked more questions. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.